Today is the fourth Sunday in the season of Epiphany. We have yet more stars which have appeared around the sanctuary. We are still remembering God's revelation of Jesus Christ to the world in the visiting of the Magi, and we are remembering that Jesus, as the Word of God come to earth, is our light in the darkness. It is a season of light. And according to the official Church of England liturgical calendar, which I know all of you have read and memorized, this season of Epiphany ends this coming Thursday, February 2nd, on the Feast of the Presentation. This is when Jesus' parents took him to the temple as an infant, 40 days following his birth, to present him and dedicate him to God. This is also known as Candlemas, and traditionally this date was revered around the world by many, many different religions, ethnic backgrounds as a celebration of light. The reason being that it is exactly the halfway point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. It marks the return of the sun and the longer days coming. We're going to hear more about that at the end of the service. But as we talk, as I go through this story we've just heard, I want you to keep this in mind, the return of light and what that meant to an ancient agrarian culture and what it means to us as well. Now, the wedding at Cana, a story that is familiar to many of us. It follows after last week's story of Jesus calling his first disciples. And, I gotta say, it's not often that I have been offered a job and 3 days later I get to go to a really slap-up party. But these disciples did, because they were also invited to this wedding, as was the custom. Pretty much everyone associated with this family would be invited. And from what we know, it would have been quite the celebration with feasting and singing and dancing and a party. As a matter of fact, the wedding feast would go on for several days, but at a certain point, they ran out of wine. And then Mary did what mothers do. She went to her son and said, "Hey, you can fix this. Come on." Is this really any different than me going to my child and saying, "Hey, my phone conked out. You can fix this. Come on." This is what mothers do. And Jesus says, whoa. What is this to me? Because he hasn't begun his public ministry. It wasn't yet completely his time. But his mother came and asked him. And there was a need at this party. And so what did Jesus do? He tells the steward to fill the jugs. Now, we've talked about this before, but for those of you who don't know this, I'll go through this again. We're not talking jugs. We're talking jugs that a child could hide in. Big earthenware jugs. And the steward filled them. Now, jugs, there's at least two, maybe more. The steward filled them with wine, or with water. I hope he didn't fill them with wine. Filled them with water, pulled it out. And it was wine, and not just wine, but really, really good wine. Which makes no sense, does it? It makes no sense. It's the end of the party. We want people to go home. I don't know about you, but when I have a dinner party and it's getting toward the end of the evening and it's time for people to leave, that's not when I pull out the devil's food cake and say, "Oh, I have cake you can have." No, that's when I start, going, "Gosh, I gotta get up early in the morning." Right? We don't pull out the best at the end. Plus, people had already been feasting and drinking, and a lot of them were drunk, tipsy, maybe even sleeping. Why would you pull out the best wine then? Well, of course, the bridegroom hadn't. Jesus had provided it. And not just enough to have that last glass and get people out the door. But a huge, overflowing, insane amount of wine. It makes no sense. I need to emphasize this. This amount of wine at the end of a party at this time, this quality of wine, it makes no sense. It defies logic. Why? Why would Jesus give this sign, which, by the way, not everybody even knew about? Nobody knew but the disciples and Mary and the steward and the bridegroom. Why would Jesus do this illogical, insane, completely unnecessary act of an overflowing amount of really good wine? I am fascinated by the ads that come through the door. I'm fascinated by them. I always take a look. I always learn something new about either Dutch culture or modern consumerism. I saved this ad. I think Suzanne's going to try to put a picture up for those of you viewing online. I saved this ad, and I want to make a note that this ad was from the 2nd of January. In other words, following New Year's, following the parties everybody had. The 2nd of January, it's good through the 22nd. It's from Chal and Chal. And I saved it for this Sunday because of the line right here. Een lekkere start. A yummy beginning. Alles om het jaar goed mee af te trappen. Everything to kick off a good year. Really? Liquor, that's what we need? Seriously, that's what this is saying. Everything you need for a good year you can buy at a liquor shop. Anybody see a problem with that? I'm sorry, anybody see a problem with that? Yeah. I take issue with that for several reasons. And it might seem odd that I'm bringing that up when I'm telling a story about Jesus providing really good wine at this party. Here's the reason. This story isn't about the wine, the alcohol. That's not what this story is about. This story, this miracle, is about the excessive, illogical, overflowing, offered to everyone, even if they don't know it, grace of God. The wedding guests didn't know where this came from, but it was still offered to them. God's love, God's grace is so big, it makes no sense. We might even think it's insane, wasteful, needless, and undeserved. Why do you give good wine to drunk people? Why is forgiveness offered to the Hitlers of the world? But that is the nature of God's grace. More than we could possibly imagine. Overflowing and better than anything we've known before. That is the point of this miracle. It's something many, many of us are embarrassed about, isn't it? We might have a hard time understanding that that level of grace and love is offered to us because we know ourselves really well. And we know we don't deserve it. I mean, let's be honest. We know we don't deserve it. And yet, even though we know we don't deserve it, we turn around and try to limit it to other people, don't we? That person isn't worthy of it. Why is God allowing grace in that person's life? But that's who God is. Gracious and loving and forgiving and over the top. Illogical by human standards. And yet, even as humans, we say things like, love conquers all, don't we? Yeah, it does. And not the, I love you. And not the, I'll be kind to you as long as you're decent. And not the, I'll share with you as long as you deserve it type of love. But love that goes beyond, that sacrifices itself, that gives and gives and gives. Within Christianity, across cultures, we talk about something called Christian disciplines. And going into Lent, February 22nd, Ash Wednesday, noonday prayer service, 7:30, imposition of ashes, FYI. Going into Lent, we'll be talking about Christian disciplines. And so often we talk about disciplines that maybe limit or pull us back, because being excessive in many ways is not healthy for us. We all know that if we eat a diet of nothing but extreme fat and alcohol, it's not good for us. We have to balance it with exercise and fruits and vegetables. We understand that excess in many ways is not healthy, and so we talk about the Christian disciplines of fasting. We talk about in Lent giving up something. We talk about making choices with our money, spending less on this so that we can give more. But there are also disciplines which involve excess. And one of those disciplines is celebration. One of the Christian disciplines, which I think we don't give enough attention to, is having a darn good party. And not just having it once in a while, but building this concept into our lives. Being welcoming, hospitable, inviting, sharing, putting the extra plate at the table, extending the table, offering grace to somebody that we don't know anything about, offering forgiveness even if the other person isn't sorry. Excessive, wonderful love that knows no bounds, that even lays down itself for the sake of another. And it is just as dangerous to not celebrate as it is to give in to hedonism and not caring about anyone else. Let me be clear. If we are greedy, excessively greedy, if we don't care, if we take all the pleasure for ourselves, that is a sin. That is evil, and that is damaging to ourselves and to other people. But if we don't celebrate, if we don't give thanks, even when it maybe doesn't make sense, if we don't express God's overflowing love, that is also a sin and evil and damaging to ourselves and to others. This concept is summed up in the biblical concept of Sabbath. And let me be clear, I said the biblical concept of Sabbath, not what society so often thinks this means. I have spoken with people for whom Sabbath was one day a week where they were tortured and they hated it. We go to church, we sit in a hard pew, there's nothing fun there, and then we went home and we had to sit in hard chairs with our back against a wall, and God forbid you fall asleep because then you got spanked, and we couldn't smile and nothing fun, and we had to sit and listen to the Bible all day long, and my butt hurt. That is not Sabbath. Sabbath is taking a break. Is choosing to rest. It's choosing to celebrate. Sabbath is spending a bit of extra time to make your favorite meal and inviting a loved one or a friend to share it and breaking out that bottle of wine that you've been saving. What are you saving it for? Share it. Sabbath is getting down the good china on a Tuesday, just because. Sabbath is taking a walk. Sabbath is playing games. Sabbath is inviting people over to listen to music or listening to your favorite music by yourself. Sabbath is celebration. We don't do that in our society. We don't really rest. We work, and then we go to sleep and we can't figure out why we're so tired in the morning. It's because we didn't rest. We didn't celebrate. We didn't play. Here's a rule of life for you. It's not time to stop work when you're finished with everything. It's time to stop work when it's time to stop work. If you work a job that ends at 5, then you end at 5. And you have that meal, and you spend time with your family or your friends or alone with a good book. We are not called to work ourselves to death. We are called to be people who understand that there's a time for work and there's a time for celebration. There's a time for rest. There is a time for excess and joy and happiness and sharing with others. We confessed this the very beginning of the service. We have not held out the word of life in a dark and twisted world. The word of life is grace, without limit, without end, all the time, everywhere, for everyone. Let's face it, it might seem irresponsible to have a party when bad things are happening. But I would say there's a difference between partying to ignore and celebrating to show something different, to make a choice to be joyful, to say thank you, to share, to invite others, and to give a glimpse that there's a different possibility for life. It might not make any human sense, but that's okay. Last week, Jason and I were given a very nice bottle of wine. Rather expensive bottle of wine for us to share. I'm sharing it with you today. It makes no sense. This was given to me and Jason for us to enjoy at home. I don't care. What's the point of enjoying it at home when we can share it with each other? So for communion today, we'll be sharing this wine. Does that sound good? And if you don't receive the chalice, never fear. We'll have it in the hall and we can give you a little slurp in a cup. Let's have a party.